The sun dipped low over the vast, untouched horizon of the New World, casting long, golden shadows across the rolling hills of Virginia and the cobblestone streets of Boston. In the early years of the 1760s, the 13 colonies existed in a state of tranquil suspension, a time that history would later remember as the deep, steady breath before a great exertion. Life here moved with the slow, rhythmic cadence of the changing seasons, governed not by the ticking of a clock, but by the rising of the sun and the turning of the tides. To the observer standing on these shores, the land seemed endless and ancient, blanketed by thick forests that whispered secrets in the wind, stretching far beyond the western edge of the map. In the villages and growing towns, the air was filled with the comforting sense of wood smoke and damp earth. Blacksmiths laid down their hammers, farmers wiped the soil from their hands, and merchants tallied their ledgers by the flickering light of tallow candles. There was a profound sense of belonging to the distant British crown, a bond that felt as natural and permanent as the Atlantic Ocean that separated them. Yet beneath this heavy blanket of peace, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, barely perceptible, like the sudden stillness of birds before a summer thunderstorm. It was a world resting in the comfort of the familiar, unaware that the winds were beginning to change direction, carrying with them the faint, distant echoes of a destiny that would soon awaken them from this long, colonial slumber. As the seasons turned, the golden haze of the early 1760s began to thin, replaced by a subtle, creeping grayness that seemed to drift across the Atlantic Ocean like a bank of sea fog rolling in from the deep waters. The peace that had blanketed the 13 colonies, that comfortable silence described in our previous chapter, began to fray at the edges, not with a sudden tear, but with the slow, imperceptible wearing down of a rope against a stone. To understand this shift, one must look not at the battlefields, for there were none yet on American soil, but at the ledgers of merchants, the heavy parchment scrolls of parliamentarians in London, and the quiet, furrowed brows of farmers in Massachusetts and Virginia. The relationship between the colonies and Great Britain, once seen as a bond between a protective parent and a dutiful child, was beginning to change, altering the very air that people breathed. This change was born in the aftermath of victory, the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that had stretched its tendrils across continents, had ended in a triumph for the British Empire. The French had been driven from the North American continent, leaving the vast, open lands to the west seemingly ripe for the taking. But victory, as history so often whispers, comes with a heavy price. The war had drained the treasuries of London. The great coffers of the king were empty, echoing with the ghosts of spent gold. In the dimly lit halls of Westminster, where the fog of the Thames often curled against the window panes, men in powdered wigs and velvet coats looked at long columns of numbers and realized that the empire was drowning in debt. And so the eyes of the crown turned westward, across the thousands of miles of ocean, toward the prosperous, growing colonies that had benefited from the protection of the British redcoats. It began with a tightening of the reins, a sensation familiar to anyone who has ridden a horse that suddenly senses a change in the rider's grip. For generations, the colonies had existed under a policy of salutary neglect. It was a gentle, unspoken agreement where London made laws, but rarely enforced them with rigor. It allowed the colonies to breathe, to grow, to trade, and to develop a sense of self-reliance that was as sturdy as the oak trees in their forests. But now, the shadow of enforcement began to fall. The first sign was not a soldier on a doorstep, but a piece of paper. The Proclamation of 1763 was issued, drawing an invisible line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. To the settlers who looked at those blue-tinged peaks with dreams of fertile valleys and new beginnings, this line was a wall. They were told they could not cross, that the land they had fought for was forbidden to them. It was a decree that sat heavy in the hearts of frontiersmen, a silent command that stifled the very spirit of expansion that defined the colonial existence. They stood on the edge of the wilderness, looking at the prohibited West, feeling the first cold touch of a distant authority telling them no. Then came the Sugar Act. It sounds almost innocuous, a law about something as sweet and common as sugar and molasses. But in the bustling ports of Boston, New York, and Charleston, where the smell of salt water mixed with the aroma of tar and spices, this act was a heavy anchor dragging on the economy. Molasses was the lifeblood of the rum trade, a staple of colonial commerce. The new enforcement meant that the customs officers, men who had previously turned a blind eye or accepted a friendly nod, were now watching. Ships were stopped. Cargo was inspected. The slow, bureaucratic process of counting barrels and checking manifests began to slow the rhythm of the docks. Captains who had sailed these waters for decades, knowing every shoal and current, now had to navigate a new, more treacherous hazard: the rigorous application of imperial law. The shadow grew longer as the merchants sat in their counting houses, the scratching of their quill pens sounding a little louder in the silence, calculating the cost of this new reality. They felt the weight of the crown not as a protector, but as a collector, a distant hand reaching into their pockets. But the shadow that truly darkened the mood, the one that brought the chill into the very hearths of the ordinary people, was the Stamp Act. It was a tax unlike any other, for it touched almost every aspect of daily life where paper was used. Imagine the texture of paper in the 18th century, thick, fibrous, handmade rag paper. Now imagine that every legal document, every will, every deed to a house, every diploma, even the newspapers that told the stories of the day and the playing cards used to pass the time in a tavern, required a royal stamp. To make anything official, to make anything real in the eyes of the law, one had to pay for this embossed mark of the king. It was not merely the cost, though the coins were hard to come by in a cash-poor society. It was the intrusion. It felt as though the government had stepped into the private lives of the colonists. When a couple wished to marry, the shadow was there on their license. When a man wished to sell a plot of land to his neighbor, the shadow was there on the deed. When friends gathered for a game of cards by the firelight, the shadow was there on the ace of spades. It was an inescapable reminder that they were subjects, bound by laws made by men who had never set foot on American soil. Men who had never seen the autumn leaves turn red in New England or felt the humid heat of a Georgia summer. The reaction to these measures was slow, like the gathering of storm clouds that drift lazily together before they turn dark. At first, it was just talk. In the taverns, where the air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of ale, the conversation began to shift. Where once men talked of the harvest, of the price of timber, or the news from relatives back in England, now they spoke of rights. It was a heavy word, a philosophical word, debated slowly and methodically. They spoke of the rights of Englishmen, a heritage they believed they carried with them across the ocean. They murmured about taxation without representation, a phrase that would later be shouted, but for now was whispered with a furrowed brow. They did not yet see themselves as revolutionaries. They saw themselves as loyal subjects who were being misunderstood, whose loyalty was being tested by a parliament that treated them as a purse to be emptied rather than a partner to be respected. The mood was somber, thoughtful, and tinged with a melancholy realization that the world was changing. The shadow also fell over the domestic sphere. In the kitchens where women baked bread and spun wool, the talk of taxes and boycotts began to seep in. The cloth from Britain, once a sign of status and comfort, began to look different. It looked like dependence. The tea that was brewed in china pots, the warmth of which had started so many mornings, began to taste bitter with the knowledge of the taxes levied upon it. There was a quiet movement towards homespun, towards making do with what was found and made in the colonies. It was a return to simplicity, driven not by poverty, but by a silent, stubborn pride. The spinning wheels turned a little faster, the looms clacked a little louder, a rhythmic answer to the silent decrees from London. This was not a violent rebellion, it was a withdrawal, a slow turning away of the face. As the months passed, the atmosphere in the cities became charged with a static electricity. The sky seemed perpetually gray, reflecting the mood of the populace. The arrival of a British ship in the harbor, once a cause for excitement and news, became a source of tension. People would stand on the docks, watching the sails furl and the anchors drop, wondering what new orders, what new restrictions, what new shadows were being offloaded along with the crates of goods. The red coats of the soldiers, once a symbol of safety against the French and the indigenous tribes, began to stand out starkly against the drab clothing of the civilians. They were becoming the other, a constant visual reminder of the force that lay behind the taxes. The soldiers, too, felt the change. They walked the cobblestone streets and felt the eyes of the locals upon them, not with admiration, but with a cold, measuring stare. The easy camaraderie was evaporating, leaving behind a damp, chilly distance. This period was the incubation of a new consciousness. It was a time of writing. Letters traveled up and down the muddy roads connecting the colonies, carried by writers through rain and mist. Men like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry were putting pens to paper, their thoughts traveling slowly from Boston to Williamsburg, from Philadelphia to Charleston. These letters were like thin threads being woven in the dark, connecting 13 separate entities into something resembling a whole. They shared their grievances, their fears, and their theories on liberty. It was a slow, intellectual awakening, a realization that the shadow falling over Massachusetts was the same shadow falling over Virginia. The colonies were discovering each other in the dark, reaching out hands to ensure they were not alone, and yet, despite the growing unease, life went on. The cows still needed to be milked, the wood needed to be chopped, and the seasons continued their relentless cycle. The snow fell in heavy, silent blankets over the north, muting the sounds of the angry town meetings. The rains washed over the southern plantations, soaking the fields where the tobacco grew. The sun rose and set, indifferent to the political currents swirling below, but the psychological landscape had been irrevocably altered. The trust, once broken, is difficult to mend. The colonists were beginning to look at the Atlantic Ocean not as a bridge to their home, but as a moat separating them from a government that no longer understood them. The shadow was not just over the land, it was over the heart. It was a time of waiting, of watching, of holding one's breath. The storm had not yet broken. There was no thunder, no lightning, just the heavy, oppressive humidity that precedes the tempest. The shadows over the 13 colonies were long and deep, stretching into the souls of the people, preparing them for the night that would have to be endured before the dawn of a new liberty could arrive. The Atlantic wind, sharp and tasting of salt and brine, swept through the narrow, winding cobblestone streets of Boston, rattling the panes of glass in the lantern-lit windows and whistling through the bare branches of the elms on the common. It was the early 1770s, and night had fallen over the harbor city, a heavy, velvet darkness that seemed to swallow the buildings whole, leaving only the faint, flickering glow of candles to mark the presence of life. In the daylight, Boston was a city of commerce, of shouting fishmongers, of creaking wagon wheels and the ringing of church bells. But at night, the city transformed. The noise of the day receded like the tide, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but pregnant with secrets. It was in this nocturnal quiet that the true heart of the coming revolution began to beat, not in the open squares or the sunlit council chambers, but in the warm, enclosed, and intimate spaces of the taverns. These public houses were more than just places to drink. They were the living rooms of the city. The sanctuaries where the cold was kept at bay by the roaring hearths and the camaraderie of shared grievances. Among them, the Green Dragon Tavern stood as a silent sentinel on Union Street, its brick walls soaking up the history that was being whispered within. Imagine stepping into such a place on a frigid November evening. As the heavy wooden door creaks open, the biting cold of the street is instantly replaced by a wall of warmth. The air inside is thick and hazy, carrying the rich, earthy scent of pipe tobacco, the yeasty aroma of brewing ale, and the roasting meat turning on a spit over the fire. The light is low and amber-colored, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Men sit hunched over sturdy oak tables, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of tallow candles and the orange light of the fireplace. They are men of all trades, silversmiths with strong, calloused hands, merchants with ink-stained fingers, dockworkers smelling of the sea, and lawyers with tired eyes. In ordinary times, their conversations would be of trade, of the price of lumber, of marriages and local gossip, but these were not ordinary times. The shadows over the colonies, which we spoke of before, had deepened, and the conversation had shifted from the loud complaints of the day to the hushed, urgent whispers of the night. If one were to sit quietly in the corner, nursing a tankard of cider, the sound of the room would feel like a low, steady hum, a vibration of discontent. The word liberty was no longer a philosophical concept discussed only by scholars. It was a word that lived in the mouths of these men, tasted and tested with every sip of ale. At one table you might see a man with a stern, intense face, his clothes simple but his presence commanding. This was Samuel Adams. He was not a soldier, nor was he a wealthy merchant. He was a man of words, a man who understood the power of the whisper. He sat not at the head of the table, but amongst the others, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room. He spoke of the latest outrages from London, of the soldiers quartered in the city who walked the streets with arrogance, of the taxes that strangled their livelihoods. He did not shout. He did not need to. In the quiet of the tavern, his whispers carried more weight than a scream. He was weaving a web of connection, turning individual frustrations into a collective resolve. He listened as much as he spoke, nodding as a shipwright described the disrespect shown by a British officer, validating the anger, stoking the embers of resentment until they glowed with a steady heat. Across the room, perhaps sitting with a sketchbook or a tool of his trade, was Paul Revere, a silversmith by day, a connector of men by night. He knew everyone, the mechanics in the North End, the wealthy patrons in the South. In the tavern, the social barriers that usually separated the classes seemed to dissolve in the smoke. Here, a mechanic could look a merchant in the eye and find a brother in the cause. The Sons of Liberty, a name that was beginning to circulate with a mix of reverence and fear, was not an army with uniforms. It was this collection of faces in the candlelight. It was a brotherhood formed in the shadows, bound by an oath of secrecy that was as solid as the stones of the tavern itself. They knew that there were spies everywhere. A waiter pouring ale might be listening for the governor. A man sitting too quietly by the door might be recording names. And so the tavern became a place of codes and signals, where a nod meant agreement and a specific toast meant loyalty. The paranoia was real, adding a layer of tension to the atmosphere, making every creak of the floorboards sound like a potential intrusion. The whispers in the Green Dragon were not just about anger, they were about organization. It was here, amidst the clinking of pewter mugs, that the chaotic energy of the mob was channeled into something disciplined. They spoke of the committees of correspondence, a network of letter writers that would link Boston to New York, to Philadelphia, to Virginia. Imagine the slow, deliberate process of planning in an age without instant communication. A thought whispered in a Boston tavern had to be written down, sealed with wax, carried by a rider on a horse through rain and mud for days, to be read in another tavern hundreds of miles away. It was a revolution of patience. The men in the tavern knew that they were playing a long game. They discussed the boycotts, the non-importation agreements. They urged each other to wear homespun clothes, to give up the luxuries that lined the pockets of the British merchants. It was a quiet rebellion of lifestyle, decided upon in these warm, smoky rooms while the winter wind howled outside. As the year 1773 approached its end, the whispers grew more focused, centering on a single commodity: tea. It was a simple leaf, dried and shipped from the other side of the world, yet it had become the symbol of tyranny. The East India Company, a giant monopoly backed by the Crown, was sending ships laden with tea to the colonies, tea that carried a tax the colonists had not voted for. In the taverns, the debate was intense. Should the ships be allowed to dock? Should the tea be landed? The whispers turned into plans. They spoke of the ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, that were making their way across the gray Atlantic, headed for Griffin's Wharf. The men in the tavern knew that once that tea was unloaded, the tax would be paid and the precedent would be set. They could not let that happen. The planning was meticulous. It was not a chaotic riot they were plotting, but a theatrical statement. They whispered of disguises, of painting their faces to look like Mohawk warriors, not to deceive anyone into thinking they were truly indigenous, but to hide their individual identities and to symbolize that they were now of this land, America, and not of Britain. The atmosphere in the taverns during those final nights of December was electric, yet controlled. The smoke from the pipes seemed to hang lower, the voices dropped an octave deeper. There was a sense of crossing a threshold. Every man in that room knew that what they were whispering about was treason. If caught, it would mean prison or the gallows. Yet looking around the room, seeing the grim determination on the faces of their neighbors, their fears subsided. They were bolstered by the strength of the collective. They were no longer just subjects, they were citizens in the making. The tavern was their parliament, the table their constitution. They mapped out the routes from the Old South meeting house to the wharf. They assigned leaders and groups. They swore oaths that if one was caught, he would not reveal the others. The Green Dragon became the hive, buzzing with the low-frequency energy of impending action. And then there were the moments of silence. The moments when the conversation paused, and the men just sat there, listening to the crackling of the fire, staring into their ales, contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to do. They thought of their families sleeping in the houses nearby, of the precariousness of their lives. These were not soldiers hungering for war. They were shopkeepers and tradesmen who simply wanted to be left alone, who wanted the freedom to govern their own affairs. The tragedy was that to be left alone, they had to step out together into the dangerous night. The weight of history was settling on their shoulders, heavy and invisible. They finished their drinks, the pewter tankards hitting the wooden tables with a dull thud. They wrapped their cloaks tight against the coming chill. As they exited the tavern, stepping out of the warm, amber glow into the biting cold of the Boston night, the whispers ceased. The time for talking was nearing its end. The snow crunched under their boots as they walked separately to their homes, shadows dispersing into the darkness. But the connection forged in that tavern remained. The ideas that had been whispered were now alive, drifting out over the rooftops of the sleeping city like the smoke from the chimney, carried on the wind towards a destiny that would wake the world. The harbor waters lapped against the pilings of the wharves, dark and waiting, soon to be turned into a brewing pot of rebellion. The quiet before the storm was over. The whispers had begun to solidify into a shout that would ring out across the centuries. The night of April 18, 1775, settled over the colony of Massachusetts with a deceptive stillness, a heavy, damp quiet that clung to the marshes and the rolling fields like a second skin. It was a spring night, yet the air held the lingering chill of a winter that was reluctant to depart. A cold that seeped through the wooden walls of the farmhouses and into the bones of the sleeping inhabitants. Above, the moon was often obscured by drifting clouds, casting the landscape into a patchwork of silver light and deep, impenetrable shadow. If one were standing on the banks of the Charles River at that midnight hour, the only sounds to be heard would have been the rhythmic lapping of the dark water against the muddy banks and the rustling of the reeds in the breeze. But then a new sound began to intrude upon the natural silence, the muffled splash of oars. Across the black expanse of the water, British troops were moving. They were not moving with the fanfare of a parade or the beating of drums that usually accompanied the king's army. They were moving with a ghostly stealth. 700 men, the elite grenadiers and light infantry, were being ferried across the river from Boston to the marshy landing point at Phipps Farm. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the longboats, their red coats turning black in the darkness, their heavy muskets held tight against their chests to prevent them from clanking against the gunwales. The orders had been given in whispers. Silence was paramount. They were marching into the countryside to seize a stockpile of gunpowder and weapons rumored to be hidden in the village of Concord, and they hoped to do so while the colony still slept. When the boats grounded on the far shore, the soldiers stepped out into knee-deep water and thick, sucking mud. It was a miserable start to a long march. Wet boots and sodden wool trousers made every step heavy as they formed their columns in the darkness. They waited there in the marshland for hours, shivering in the cold, damp air, waiting for provisions that would never arrive, before finally beginning their trudge towards the sleeping villages. The rhythm of their march was a low, scuffling thud against the dirt road, hundreds of boots striking the earth in unison, a sound that was felt in the ground almost before it was heard. As they marched, the countryside around them was not as asleep as they had hoped. The ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes had already sent a ripple of alarm spreading outward from Boston like a wave. In the distance, faint lights began to flicker in the windows of isolated farmhouses. Church bells began to toll, not with the slow, mournful cadence of a funeral, but with a hurried, insistent clamor that cut through the night air. The dogs on the farms began to bark, passing the warning from one homestead to the next. The British officers, mounted on horses that snorted in the cold air, looked into the darkness with growing unease. They realized that the element of surprise had evaporated into the mist. The road ahead was not empty, it was watching them. By the time the column of redcoats reached the outskirts of Lexington, the sky to the east was beginning to lighten with the first gray hues of dawn. It was that ambiguous time of day when the world loses its color, suspended between the darkness of night and the clarity of morning. The mist lay thick on the ground, swirling around the knees of the marching soldiers, obscuring the path ahead. The air was crisp and smelled of wet earth and the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimneys where early fires were being lit. In the center of Lexington, on the village green, a triangle of common grass bounded by roads and the meeting house, a group of men had gathered. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wore no uniforms. They wore the rough, homespun clothes of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. They were fathers and sons, neighbors who had known each other all their lives. They stood in the damp grass, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, holding muskets that were mostly used for hunting fowl or protecting livestock. They were the militia, the Minutemen, commanded by Captain John Parker, a man already weary from illness but standing firm with his neighbors. There were only about 77 of them, a tiny, fragile line of humanity standing against the might of the British Empire. They did not stand in a perfect formation. They stood in a loose cluster, uncertain, frightened, but resolute. They were there not to start a war, but to make a statement, to show that they were present, that they were watching. As the British vanguard appeared through the morning fog, the visual contrast was striking. The king's soldiers were a machine of war, a wall of discipline and color. Even in the low light, their polished buckles gleamed, and their red coats stood out violently against the gray morning. They marched with a precision that was terrifying to behold, the sound of their boots now loud and undeniable. Major Pitcairn, leading the British advance, rode forward, swinging his sword, and shouted into the morning air. His voice was harsh, shattering the fragile peace of the dawn. "Disperse, ye rebels. Ye villains, disperse, lay down your arms." The command echoed off the wooden walls of the Buckman Tavern nearby. On the green, Captain Parker saw the futility of the situation. He knew his men were vastly outnumbered. He did not want a massacre. He ordered his men to disperse, to go home, but to keep their muskets. The men began to slowly break apart, turning to walk away, stepping back into the shadows of the trees and the edges of the green. The crisis seemed to be passing. The confrontation was dissolving into a tense but bloodless retreat, and then it happened. A sound, a single sharp crack that tore through the heavy morning air like a whip. To this day, amidst the fog of history and the literal mist of that April morning, no one knows who fired it. Was it a nervous farmer, his finger slipping on the trigger of an old musket? Was it a British soldier, startled by a sudden movement in the trees? Was it a pistol shot from an officer? The origin of that sound has been lost to the silence of the centuries, but its result was instantaneous and irreversible. That single shot was the spark that ignited the powder keg of a continent. For a split second, time seemed to stand still, the echo of the shot hanging in the air, vibrating in the ears of every man on that green. Then the British line, conditioned by years of drill and discipline, reacted. Without a direct order, a ragged volley of musket fire erupted from the redcoat ranks. The sound was deafening, a roar of thunder on the ground. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed out, mixing with the morning mist, creating a blinding, choking cloud. The balls of lead whistled through the air, tearing into the bark of the trees and the bodies of the men. On the green, men fell. Jonas Parker, a cousin of the captain, was hit, collapsing into the grass he had walked on his whole life. Others scrambled for cover, returning scattered, desperate fire before fleeing behind the stone walls and into the woods. The skirmish was over almost as soon as it had begun. The smoke drifted slowly away on the morning breeze, revealing the aftermath. 8 colonists lay dead or dying on the wet grass of Lexington Green. 10 more were wounded. The British troops, their blood now up, cheered, a rough, guttural sound of victory that seemed out of place in the quiet village. But their officers quickly regained control, reforming the lines, checking their weapons. The sun was now fully rising, casting long, golden beams through the lingering smoke, illuminating the red stains on the green. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of shock, of horror. The birds, which had been silenced by the roar of the muskets, began to sing again, indifferent to the tragedy below. The British column, leaving the dead behind, reformed and continued their march westward towards Concord. They moved with the confidence of a superior force, unaware that the sound of those shots was already traveling faster than their marching feet. It was traveling across the fields, carried by riders, carried by the wind, waking the entire countryside. The road to Concord was 6 miles long, a winding path through forests and farmland. As the British marched, the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, warming the air. The beauty of the day stood in stark contrast to the grim purpose of the march. In Concord, the warning had been received. The town was awake. Supplies were being hidden, Cannon were being buried in furrows of plowed fields, and militia from the surrounding towns were pouring in. They gathered on the high ground, looking down at the town as the British troops arrived. The redcoats began to search the town, breaking open barrels of flour, burning gun carriages. The smoke from these fires rose into the sky, a pillar of gray that was seen by the militia gathering on the hills. They mistook the burning of supplies for the burning of their homes. A resolve hardened in their hearts. They moved down towards the North Bridge, a wooden structure spanning the slow-moving Concord River. Below the bridge, the water reflected the blue sky and the white clouds, a peaceful mirror soon to be shattered. A detachment of British soldiers guarded the bridge. As the militia advanced, not as a disorganized mob, but in an orderly column of two, the British fired. This time, the colonists did not disperse. They obeyed the order of their commander, Major Buttrick. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." The volley that returned from the militia was disciplined and deadly. It was the moment the world turned upside down. Farmers were firing upon the king's army. Officers fell. The British line broke. For the first time, the redcoats turned their backs and ran. They retreated back towards the main body of troops in the town. The silence of the river was replaced by the groans of the wounded and the shouting of men. But the true horror for the British was yet to come. As they began their long retreat back to Boston, the day had fully transformed. The shot heard round the world had summoned a storm. From every village, every farm, every crossroad, men were coming. They did not stand in open fields to be shot down. They fought like the indigenous warriors they had learned from. They hid behind the stone walls that lined the roads, behind the thick trunks of oak trees, inside the barns. The road back to Boston became a gauntlet of fire. The British soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and terrified, marched down a road that seemed to be alive with enemies. Smoke puffed from the woods, followed by the whistle of a ball. A soldier would fall, and there would be no enemy to see, only the swaying branches and the stone walls. The orderly column began to disintegrate into a desperate mob, marching only to survive. The sun began to set, casting the world once again into shadows. The long, bloody day of April 19, 1775 was drawing to a close. The British finally reached the safety of Charlestown, under the guns of their warships, but the world they had stepped out of that morning no longer existed. The psychological landscape of the colonies had been altered as violently as the physical landscape of Lexington Green. The quiet, boring history of colonial submission was over. A new chapter had begun, written not in ink, but in the smoke of muskets and the resolve of ordinary men. As the night fell again, the fires of the militia camps dotted the hills surrounding Boston, a ring of light in the darkness, signaling that the 13 colonies were no longer sleeping. They were awake and they were at war. The echo of that first shot would ripple outward, across the ocean, across the years, eventually toppling thrones and rewriting the maps of the world, but for now, it simply faded into the chirping of crickets and the heavy, exhausted breathing of a nation born in blood and smoke. Far to the south of the smoke-filled village greens of Lexington and Concord, the city of Philadelphia lay baking under the humid haze of a Pennsylvania spring in May of 1775. If Boston was the clenched fist of the colonies, Philadelphia was its thinking mind, a sprawling grid of red brick and cobblestone that sat nestled between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. It was the largest city in British America, a cosmopolitan hub where the languages of the world mingled in the market squares, and the masts of tall ships crowded the wharves like a leafless forest. But as the delegates from the 13 colonies began to arrive, riding in dust-covered carriages or on weary horses, they found a city that felt different than before. The air was heavy, not just with the impending summer heat, but with the weight of the news that had traveled down the coast. The war had begun. The blood had been shed. The theoretical debates about taxes and representation were over, replaced by the grim reality of musket balls and funerals. It was in this atmosphere of heavy, unspoken dread that the Second Continental Congress convened, not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the quiet, somber shuffling of boots on the wooden floors of the Pennsylvania State House. Imagine entering that room on Chestnut Street. It is a space defined by dignity and restraint. The walls are paneled in white. The windows are large and multi-paned, allowing the pale light to wash over the rows of tables covered in green baize cloth. The room smells of old wood, of beeswax polish, of ink, and the faint, stale odor of tobacco smoke that clings to the velvet curtains. Outside, the city bustles with the noise of carts and street vendors, but inside, the world is hushed, insulated by the thick brick walls. The delegates who fill the chairs are not young revolutionaries with wild eyes. They are men of substance, men of property, lawyers, merchants, and plantation owners. They are men who have everything to lose. As they take their seats, there is a profound sense of gravity. They nod to one another, exchanging low greetings, but their eyes are shadowed with worry. They know that by merely gathering here, in defiance of the king's authority, they are flirting with treason. And the penalty for treason is not a fine, it is the gallows. In the center of this gathering sits John Hancock, the president of the Congress. He is a wealthy man, impeccably dressed, but his face betrays the strain of his position. He sits in the high-backed chair, a gavel resting on the table before him. The sound of that gavel striking the wood is not sharp, but dull, a rhythmic thud that calls the room to order, signaling the beginning of days that would turn into weeks. And weeks that would blade into months of endless deliberation. The pace of the Congress is slow, maddeningly slow for those who crave action, but necessary for a group of men trying to steer a ship through a hurricane without a map. They speak in long, eloquent sentences, citing Roman history and English common law, their voices rising and falling in the stifling heat of the room. The windows are often kept closed to keep their debates secret from the spies who surely walk the streets outside, and so the air inside becomes thick and still, buzzing with the lazy drone of flies that drift in from the stables nearby. Among the crowd there is an old man, resting his chin on his cane, his spectacles catching the light. Benjamin Franklin has returned from London, and he brings with him the weary wisdom of someone who has seen the heart of the empire and knows it is hardening. He speaks less than the others, often appearing to be half asleep, lulled by the humidity and his own advanced years, but his mind is alert, watching, calculating. He is the anchor, the presence that lends legitimacy to this gathering of rebels. Beside the firebrands, he is a cooling influence, a reminder that they are playing a game of high stakes that requires patience above all else. Then there is John Adams of Massachusetts. He is short, stout, and bursting with an energy that he struggles to contain. He is the engine of independence, the man who has been arguing for this moment for years. But even he is subdued here, sensing that he must not push too hard, too fast. He looks around the room and sees men from the southern colonies who are not yet ready to cut the cord with Britain, men who still toast the king at dinner and pray for reconciliation. Adams knows he must wait, he must guide them slowly, like a shepherd guiding a flock through a dark valley. There is one man, however, who draws the eye not by what he says, for he says almost nothing, but by what he wears. Colonel George Washington of Virginia stands tall, towering over most of the other delegates. He does not wear the silk breeches and velvet coats of the politicians. He arrives each day wearing the blue and buff uniform of the Virginia militia. It is a silent statement, a visual declaration that screams louder than any speech. While others debate the wording of petitions, Washington is dressed for war. He sits quietly near the door, his posture erect, his face composed in a mask of stoic calm. He listens to the debates, his blue eyes scanning the room, absorbing the arguments, measuring the men around him. He knows, perhaps better than anyone, the terrible reality of what war with Britain actually means. He has fought alongside the British. He knows their discipline, their firepower, their ruthlessness. He knows that the militia in Boston, brave as they are a disorganized rabble facing the finest army in the world. His silence is heavy, a reservoir of strength that the others begin to lean on unconsciously. As the days of May and June drift by, the heat in Philadelphia grows more oppressive. The delegates wipe their brows with linen handkerchiefs, the powdered wigs itching their scalps. The debates grind on. They draft the olive branch petition, a final, desperate plea to King George to intervene and stop the violence. It is written with the trembling hand of loyalty, a document stained with the tears of men who do not want to leave their mother country. But at the same time, in a contradiction that defines the human condition, they begin to discuss the creation of an army. They realize that they cannot beg for peace with empty hands. They need a sword to back up their pen. The question arises, who will lead this army? Who can possibly unite the rough farmers of New England with the aristocratic planters of the South? Who has the experience, the temperament, and the trust of all? The room falls silent as John Adams rises to speak on the 14th of June. The air is thick, the only sound the scratching of the clerk's quill on parchment. Adams begins to describe the qualities needed for a commander-in-chief. He speaks of a man of independent fortune, of great talents and excellent universal character. He speaks of a man who would unite the colonies. As he speaks, eyes begin to turn. They turn towards the tall man in the blue uniform sitting near the door. Washington, realizing what is happening, realizing that the mantle is falling upon him, rises quietly. He does not seek the glory, he shrinks from it. With a humble bow, he slips out of the room into the library, unable to sit and hear his own praises, unable to face the moment when his life would no longer be his own. The doors close behind him with a soft click, leaving the room to its destiny. The vote is unanimous. It is done. George Washington is named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. When he returns the next day to accept the commission, the room is filled with a solemnity that feels like a church service. He stands before them, not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the reluctance of a martyr. He pulls a piece of paper from his pocket and reads a short speech. His voice is low, steady, but tinged with a deep sadness. He tells them that he does not think himself equal to the command he is honored with. He refuses a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. It is a moment of supreme theater, but it is also deeply genuine. In that hot, crowded room, amidst the smell of sweat and old paper, a transfer of power occurs that is unlike any in history. A republic is being born, not in a palace, but in a meeting hall, led not by a king who claims a divine right, but by a citizen who claims only a duty to serve. As the session adjourns for the day, the delegates spill out into the late afternoon sun of Philadelphia. The shadows are long on the cobblestones. The world looks the same as it did in the morning. The taverns are open, the horses are drinking from the troughs, the church bells are ringing, but everything has changed. They have created an army. They have chosen a general. They have taken the step from protest to organized resistance. Washington walks back to his lodgings, the weight of the continent now resting squarely on his shoulders. He writes a letter to his wife, Martha, back at Mount Vernon. The letter is tender, filled with regret that he cannot come home, that he must embark on a destiny which I could not avoid. He imagines the quiet fields of his plantation. The Potomac River flowing slowly past his window, a piece that he is now leaving behind, perhaps forever. The sun sets over the city, casting the State House into silhouette. The lamps are lit in the streets, creating pools of yellow light in the gathering dark. The gathering of minds has done its work for now. The shouting is over, the arguments have ceased for the night. The city sleeps, but it is a restless sleep. In the dreams of the delegates, they see the storm clouds gathering, darker and more terrible than before. They have lit a candle in the darkness, a fragile flame of liberty, and now they must shield it from the hurricane that is coming from across the sea. The night deepens, the sounds of the city fade into a whisper, and history waits, holding its breath for the next chapter to begin. The summer of 1776 descended upon the city of Philadelphia with a suffocating, blanketed heat that seemed to press the very air out of the cobblestone streets. It was a humid, relentless warmth that rose from the damp earth of the riverbanks and settled heavy between the red brick buildings, turning the bustling city into a slow-moving tableau of perspiration and fatigue. In the upper room of a brick house on the corner of 7th and Market Streets, a young man sat alone, far removed from the noise of the carts and the cries of the street vendors below. The room was rented from a bricklayer named Jacob Graff, chosen specifically for its relative isolation and the way the air moved through the open windows, though on days like this, even the breeze felt like the breath of a furnace. The man was Thomas Jefferson, a tall, lanky Virginian with reddish hair and a quiet, contemplative demeanor. He sat before a small, portable writing desk made of mahogany, a device of his own design, smooth and polished, resting on a table that was cluttered with the tools of an intellectual trade. There were books bound in leather, their spines cracked from use, pamphlets filled with political theory, and sheets of blank paper that waited with a terrifying patience for the ink that would define a nation. The task before him was monumental, yet the atmosphere in the room was one of profound stillness. The only sounds were the rhythmic buzzing of a fly against the window pane and the soft, scratching friction of a goosequill pen moving across the texture of the paper. Jefferson had been tasked by the Continental Congress, specifically by a committee of 5 men, including the formidable John Adams and the wise Benjamin Franklin, to draft a declaration. It was to be a document that would explain to the world, to the courts of Europe, to the people of the colonies, and to history itself, why they were choosing to sever the ties with Great Britain. It was a task of translation, turning the raw, chaotic anger of a rebellion into the elegant, immutable logic of a cause. Jefferson sat in his waistcoat, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, staring at the blank whiteness of the parchment. He dipped the quill into the silver inkstand, watching the black liquid bead at the tip, a droplet of potential that held the weight of treason and the promise of liberty. He did not seek to invent new principles. As he would later say, he aimed to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. He was channeling the whispers of the taverns, the arguments of the pamphlets, and the philosophy of the Enlightenment into a single, cohesive narrative. He wrote slowly, his hand moving with a deliberate grace. When in the course of human events, the words flowed not like a torrent, but like a steady stream finding its path through the landscape of political thought. He wrote of the laws of nature, of the God of nature, grounding the rebellion not in the petty squabbles of taxes, but in the eternal architecture of the universe. The room grew darker as the afternoon wore on, the shadows stretching long across the wooden floorboards. Jefferson would pause, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, searching for the perfect cadence, the rhythm that would make the words sing. He crossed out lines, the ink smudging slightly, and rewrote them. He sought a tone that was firm but not hysterical, a tone of sorrowful necessity. He wrote of self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In the silence of that rented room, these words did not sound like a war cry. They sounded like a prayer, a meditation on the dignity of the human spirit. The scratching of the pen continued into the evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, replaced by the soft, flickering glow of candlelight. The flame danced in the stagnant air, illuminating the pages that were slowly filling with the neat, legible script of the Virginian. It was a solitary act of creation, a man alone with his thoughts and his ink. Unaware that the sentences he was crafting would one day be carved into stone monuments and recited by schoolchildren centuries later. He was simply a man trying to articulate the pain of his country. When the draft was finished, it was presented to the Congress in the Pennsylvania State House. The scene shifted from the quiet solitude of Jefferson's room to the stifling, tension-filled chamber where the delegates gathered. The windows were kept closed to prevent spies from listening, trapping the heat and the humidity inside. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale tobacco, and the horseflies that invaded from a nearby stable. Biting through the silk stockings of the men who were trying to decide the fate of a continent. Jefferson sat silently in the back, feeling the agonizing vulnerability of an author watching his work being dissected. The delegates picked at the text. They debated every phrase, every assertion. They cut out roughly a quarter of what Jefferson had written, including a passionate passage condemning the slave trade, a deletion that would haunt the nation for generations. Jefferson winced at every change, feeling it as a personal wound, but he remained silent, while the elderly Benjamin Franklin sat beside him, offering quiet words of comfort. The process was slow, grinding, and exhaustive. It was a battle fought with words, where commas and adjectives were the weapons. The days dragged on, the temperature rising, the tempers fraying, but slowly through the friction of debate, the document was polished. It was stripped of its rhetorical excesses and left as a stark, shining pillar of defiance. On the 2nd of July, the Congress voted for independence. It was done. The legal bond was broken. But the document, the explanation, was approved on the 4th. The approval was a quiet moment, a voice vote in a tired room, but then began the physical process of making it real. The words had to be transferred from the rough, edited draft onto the official parchment. This was the work of the engrosser, Timothy Matlack, a man with a steady hand and beautiful penmanship. Imagine the scene at his desk, a large skin of parchment, treated and stretched until it was smooth and durable, waiting to receive the final text. Matlack dipped his pen and began the large, ornate lettering. In Congress, July 4, 1776. The ink he used was made from iron gall, a mixture of tannins and iron salts that would bite into the parchment, turning a deep, indelible black that would oxidize and darken with time. He wrote with the precision of a machine, ensuring that every loop, every curve, every dot was perfect. This was not just a letter, it was a legal instrument, a title deed to a new country. The sound of his pen was the sound of permanence. He was etching the fluid ideas of liberty into a physical form that could be rolled up, carried, and preserved. The signing of this parchment did not happen all at once in a joyous ceremony on the 4th, as legend often suggests. It was a slower, more somber affair that took place mostly on the 2nd of August. The heat of the summer had not broken. The delegates returned to the State House, walking past the tables to sign their names. The mood was not one of triumph, but of solemn gravity. They were signing a death warrant. By putting their names on this parchment, they were identifying themselves as traitors to the crown. If the revolution failed, this document would be the evidence used to hang them. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rustle of the parchment and the scratch of the quill. John Hancock, the president, signed first, his signature large, bold, and center, a flourish of defiance that seemed to dare the king to read it without spectacles. Then the others followed, state by state, north to south. There was little talking. Perhaps a grim joke or two was whispered. Benjamin Franklin reportedly murmured that they must all hang together, or most assuredly they would all hang separately, but mostly. There was just the weight of the moment. The ink glistened wet on the surface of the animal skin before drying into the fibers. 56 men eventually signed, 56 names in brown iron-gall ink. Each signature was a life, a fortune, and a sacred honor pledged to a cause that, at that moment, looked almost hopeless. The British fleet was gathering in New York Harbor, a massive armada of destruction. The Continental Army was ragged and outnumbered. And yet here they were, men of law and letters, fighting back with a piece of parchment. When the last name was signed, the document was not framed or paraded. It was rolled up and stored away. But the words had already escaped the room. They were being printed on broadsides, hasty copies commanded by John Dunlap, who worked through the night in his print shop, the rhythm of the printing press replacing the scratch of the quill. These copies were carried by writers galloping out of Philadelphia into the cool night air, heading for the army camps, for the town squares, for the distant colonies. Back in the State House, the room slowly emptied. The candles were extinguished, leaving the smell of smoke hanging in the air. The green baize tables were cleared. The inkstands were corked. The flies settled on the window sills. Philadelphia slept under the heavy blanket of the summer night, the humidity finally easing slightly with the coming of the dark. But in the silence of that sleeping city, something had fundamentally changed. The ink had dried, but the idea it carried had just begun to breathe. It was no longer a theory discussed by intellectuals. It was a reality forged in ink and parchment. The United States of America existed now, not yet on a map and not yet one on the battlefield, but it existed on that skin of parchment, held together by the glue of shared risk and the indelible stain of the written word. The quiet work of the mind was finished. The loud, brutal work of the sword was about to begin. The quiet before the storm was a distant memory. The storm was now here, and it carried with it the rustling sound of a single piece of paper that weighed more than all the armies of the king. The night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the affairs of men, watching over a world that had been rewritten by the stroke of a pen. The ink on the parchment of the Declaration of Independence had barely had time to fully cure before the harsh, unyielding reality of war descended upon the city of New York in the late summer of 1776. If Philadelphia had been the cradle of high ideals and philosophical debate, New York Harbor was now the stage for a terrifying display of imperial power. By August, the waters around the city, usually dotted with merchant sloops and fishing vessels, had been transformed into a floating forest of bare masts. The British fleet, the largest armada ever sent from the shores of Europe, had arrived. Hundreds of ships, their wooden hulls looming dark against the gray water, filled the Narrows, carrying tens of thousands of professional soldiers, Hessian mercenaries, and heavy cannon. To the ragtag Continental Army, dug in on the heights of Brooklyn and the tip of Manhattan, the sight was not just intimidating, it was a vision of inevitable doom. The air in the city was thick not only with the humidity of August, but with a palpable dread. A heavy silence that settled over the camps as the men looked out at the overwhelming force arrayed against them. The joy of July had evaporated, replaced by the grim knowledge that a piece of paper could not stop a cannonball. The battle, when it finally came in late August, was a disaster for the Americans. On the fields of Long Island, amidst the tall grass and the summer heat, the inexperienced colonial troops were outmaneuvered, outflanked, and broken. They were chased back to their fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, a precarious position with the East River at their backs and the victorious British Army in front of them, digging trenches and preparing for a final siege. The situation was catastrophic. General George Washington, watching from his saddle with a face that betrayed no emotion, but whose heart must have been heavy with the weight of potential annihilation, knew that his army was trapped. If the British fleet sailed into the East River, cutting off their escape to Manhattan, the revolution would end there, strangled in its infancy. But then the weather turned. As if nature itself was taking a hand in the fate of the young nation, a nor'easter, a powerful storm blowing from the northeast, swept in. The skies turned a bruised purple, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. It battered the tents, turned the trenches into rivers of mud, and soaked the soldiers to the bone. But crucially, the fierce wind prevented the British warships from sailing up the river. For 2 days, the armies sat in the rain, a miserable, wet pause in the violence. The sound of the world was reduced to the relentless drumming of water on canvas and the squelching of boots in the deepening mire. It was in this dark, wet interlude, on the night of August 29th, that Washington made a decision that would become legendary not for its boldness of attack, but for its genius of escape. He decided to evacuate the entire army, 9,000 men, along with their horses, cannon, and supplies, across the mile-wide expanse of the turbulent East River to the safety of Manhattan. All under the noses of the British who were camped just a few hundred yards away. It was a maneuver that required absolute secrecy and absolute silence. The order went out in whispers. The men were told to pack up, not for a retreat, but to move to new positions. No fires were lit. No drums were beat. The army began to move like a great, sluggish beast waking from a slumber, flowing down the muddy roads toward the ferry landing at Brooklyn. The operation relied entirely on a specific group of men, the Marblehead Regiment from Massachusetts. These were not farmers or shopkeepers. They were fishermen, men of the sea who had spent their lives navigating the treacherous, rocky coasts of New England. They were led by Colonel John Glover, a short, stocky man with a voice roughened by salt air. In the pitch blackness of the night, amidst the howling wind and the pelting rain, these men took charge of the flotilla of flat-bottomed boats, sloops, and skiffs that had been hastily gathered. The scene at the riverbank was one of controlled chaos. The rain hissed into the black water, which churned with the strong currents of the tidal strait. The Marblehead men, soaked to the skin, their hands calloused and sure, loaded the frightened soldiers into the boats. They wrapped the oarlocks in rags and heavy cloth to muffle the sound of the wood grinding against wood. There was no talking, only the rhythmic splash of the oars dipping into the water and the heavy breathing of the rowers as they pulled against the current. Back and forth they went, invisible shuttles weaving through the tapestry of the storm, ferrying the soul of the revolution from one shore to the other. As the night wore on, the wind began to die down, but the darkness remained their shield. Washington stood at the ferry landing, a towering, silent figure in his wet cloak, refusing to board a boat until the last of his men were safe. He watched the slow procession, the loading of the heavy cannons, the nervous horses being led onto the ramps, their hooves muffled with hay. The tension was excruciating. If the British woke up, if a single picket fired a warning shot, the artillery would rain down on the crowded boats, turning the river into a slaughterhouse. Every creak of a wagon wheel, every curse of a soldier who slipped in the mud, sounded like a thunderclap in the ears of the officers. Yet the British camp remained silent, lulled by the rain and the confidence of their victory, unaware that their prey was slipping through their fingers like water. But as the night began to fade and the first hints of morning approached, a new danger arose. A significant portion of the army was still on the Brooklyn side. The dawn was coming. The sun would reveal the operation to the British sentries on the heights. Panic began to rise in the chests of the rear guard. They could see the gray light creeping into the eastern sky. The wind had stopped, leaving the water calm but the air clear. It seemed that disaster was inevitable. They would be seen, targeted, and destroyed. And then the miracle happened. It did not come with a flash of lightning, but with a soft, creeping whiteness. A thick, dense fog began to roll in from the river and the sea. It was not a patchy mist, but a solid wall of white that swallowed the world. It moved silently, blanketing the river, the ferry landing, and the heights of Brooklyn. The fog was so thick that a man could not see his own hands stretched out in front of him. It dampened all sound, creating a cocoon of sensory isolation. To the soldiers waiting on the shore, it felt like a cold, wet embrace. The British, just a few hundred yards away, were completely blinded. They could hear nothing, see nothing. Under this providential cover, the retreat continued with renewed urgency. The boats moved like ghosts in a cloud. The rowers could not see the opposite shore. They navigated by instinct and by the faint calls from the Manhattan side. The boatmen rowed until their arms burned, their movements hidden within the gray void. The rear guard, who had been preparing to fight to the death, slipped away from their trenches, leaving their campfires burning to deceive the enemy, and vanished into the mist. Washington was the last to leave. He stepped onto the final boat just as the fog began to lift, dissolving under the rising sun. As the mist cleared, revealing the sparkling water of the East River, the British officers peered through their spyglasses at the American fortifications. They expected to see the rebels manning the walls, ready for the final assault. Instead, they saw nothing. The trenches were empty, the cannon were gone, the tents were silent. The entire American army, 9,000 strong, had simply evaporated. They looked across the river and saw the last of the boats landing on the Manhattan shore, safely out of range. The Fox, as they would later call Washington, had escaped the trap. The exhausted Continental soldiers collapsed on the streets of New York, their uniforms caked with mud, their bodies shivering from the damp cold, but they were alive. They had lived to fight another day. The retreat was not a victory in the traditional sense. Flags were not captured, territory was not gained, but it was a victory of survival. It was a masterpiece of logistics, endurance, and luck, executed in the quiet, terrifying hours of the night. As the sun finally broke through the clouds over New York that morning, casting long shadows across the water, the river flowed on, indifferent to the history it had just witnessed. The mist that had saved them had dissipated into the blue sky, leaving behind only the memory of the muffled oars and the silent, ghostly passage of an army that refused to die. The war would go on, long and bloody, but the revolution had survived its darkest night, carried to safety on the back of a storm and hidden within the folds of a morning fog. The autumn leaves that had once covered the ground in a tapestry of red and gold had long since rotted into the mud, and the mud itself had frozen into jagged ruts as the year 1776 drew to its bitter. Shivering close. The hope that had bloomed in the summer with the signing of the Declaration had withered under the relentless assault of the British war machine. Washington's army, battered and shrinking with every mile, had been chased across the flat, gray landscape of New Jersey, pushed all the way to the western banks of the Delaware River. Now it was December. The world had turned into a monochrome study of white snow, black trees, and gray skies. The air was not just cold, it was a physical weight, a biting, malicious presence that sought out every gap in a soldier's threadbare coat and every hole in his worn-out shoes. It was a time of profound desperation, a time when the sunshine patriot had gone home to the warmth of his hearth, leaving only the few, the ragged, and the resolute to stand guard on the frozen riverbank. On the night of December 25th, Christmas night, a silence that was both holy and heavy settled over the encampment at McConkey's Ferry. Under normal circumstances, this night would be filled with the sounds of celebration, of carols sung by the fire, of roasted meat and warm cider. But here on the Pennsylvania side of the river, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the bare branches of the sycamores and the ominous, grinding noise rising from the water. The Delaware River, usually a broad, flowing avenue of commerce, had transformed into a chaotic, churning gauntlet. Large chunks of ice, broken loose from the frozen expanses upstream, were floating down the current. They were jagged, white monsters in the darkness, crashing against each other with the sound of crushing stone, spinning and tumbling in the black water. It was this river, this swirling torrent of ice and freezing water, that stood between the dying revolution and its last, desperate chance for survival. As the sun set early in the afternoon, barely piercing the heavy slate-gray clouds, the temperature began to plummet. Then, the weather turned from bad to worse. A nor'easter began to blow, driving a stinging cocktail of snow and sleet into the faces of the men. It was a weather front that erased the horizon, blending the river and the sky into a single wall of impenetrable darkness. Washington, wrapped in his heavy cloak, watched the river with a stoic calmness that belied the gamble he was about to take. He had ordered a crossing. It was a plan born of necessity, a strike that had to happen before the enlistments of his men expired at the end of the year. The order was given in low voices, passing from tent to tent, rousing men who were huddled together for warmth. Victory or death was the password for the night, a phrase that was not a melodramatic flourish, but a literal description of their reality. The soldiers began to move towards the landing area. They were a ghostly procession in the driving snow. Many of them had no boots. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks or old rags, leaving bloody footprints on the sharp, frozen crust of the snow. They marched in silence, heads bowed against the wind, their muskets held under their coats to keep the powder dry. Down at the water's edge, the vehicles of their passage awaited. These were not military landing craft. They were Durham boats, massive, high-walled cargo vessels usually used to haul iron ore and grain. They were painted black, blending perfectly into the night. They were sturdy, heavy, and ungainly, designed for endurance rather than speed. Manning these beasts were the men of Glover's Marblehead Regiment, the same amphibious saviors who had rescued the army from New York. These fishermen, with their hands hardened by years of hauling nets in the North Atlantic, looked at the ice-choked river with a grim professional assessment. They knew the danger. They knew that a collision with a large flow could crush the hull of a boat or capsize it, dumping men and cannons into the freezing water where death would come in minutes. Yet they took their positions at the long, heavy sweep oars, their faces set against the sleet. The loading began. It was a slow, agonizing process. First, the men, stepping carefully into the rocking boats, huddled together on the wet floorboards, their teeth chattering, the cold seeping through the wood. Then came the horses, terrified by the darkness and the unstable footing, their hooves stamping nervously on the timber. And finally, the artillery, the heavy iron cannons that Washington insisted on bringing. The weight of the guns settled the boats lower into the water, dangerously close to the waterline. The wind howled, whipping the river into white-capped waves that splashed over the gunwales, freezing instantly upon contact with the wood, coating everything in a slick, treacherous glaze of ice. Washington boarded one of the first boats. The order was given to push off. The heavy poles pushed against the muddy bank, and the boats drifted out into the current. Immediately, the struggle began. The current was strong, and the ice was a relentless enemy. Great blocks of white ice, some as large as the boats themselves, loomed out of the darkness, driven by the current. The Marblehead men used their poles not just to propel the boats, but to fend off the ice, pushing the jagged floes away with desperate strength. The sound was terrifying, the loud crack of ice impacting the hull, the scraping screech as it slid along the side, the shouts of the coxswains steering the vessels. Starboard, pull. Pull, the voices were swallowed by the wind, requiring them to shout into the utter blackness. For the soldiers huddled in the boats, the crossing was an eternity of sensory deprivation and cold terror. They could see nothing but the swirling snow and the dark shapes of the ice. They could feel the boat lurch and shudder with every impact. The spray from the river froze on their coats, turning their uniforms into stiff, icy armor. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing what little body heat they had, staring into the void, wondering if this black river would be their grave. There was no talking among the infantry. The situation was too precarious for words. They simply endured, drifting in a suspended state of freezing misery, trusting entirely in the dark figures laboring at the oars. The crossing was supposed to be finished by midnight, but the ice and the storm slowed everything down. The hours dragged on. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. The storm intensified, the snow turning to a driving hail that stung the skin like gravel. Washington, standing tall in his boat, watched the progress with growing anxiety. He knew that daylight would ruin the surprise, but there was no turning back. The die was cast on the dark waters. The only way was forward into the teeth of the storm. On the New Jersey side, the first boats grounded on the riverbank. The men scrambled out, their limbs stiff and numb, slipping on the icy mud. They hauled the boats up, unloaded the shivering horses and the ice-rimed cannons, and then the boats turned back into the darkness to fetch the next wave. It was a relentless cycle of ferrying, a conveyor belt of determination moving across the barrier of nature. Colonel Henry Knox, the commander of the artillery, stood on the bank, his booming voice one of the few things that could cut through the gale, directing the landings, keeping the chaos at bay. As the last of the troops finally stepped onto the Jersey shore, it was nearly 4 in the morning. The sky was still pitch black, the storm showing no sign of relenting. The army was now on the enemy's side of the river, but they were 9 miles from their target at Trenton. They were wet, frozen, and exhausted, having not slept for 24 hours. The river lay behind them, a conquered beast, its black water still churning with the ice that had failed to stop them, but the crossing was only the beginning. As the men formed up in the darkness, checking their muskets, trying to dry their priming pans with the edges of their coats, a strange silence settled over the ranks. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of focus. They had crossed the Rubicon of the Revolution. They had survived the ice. The cold had numbed their bodies, but it had crystallized their resolve. Washington mounted his horse, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked down the long, snow-covered road that led south towards Trenton. The road was invisible in the storm, just a pale strip of white disappearing into the gray void. He gave the order to march. The sound of thousands of boots crunching into the frozen snow began, a slow, rhythmic, muffled cadence that replaced the sound of the river. They moved out, leaving the roaring Delaware behind them, walking into the curtain of snow, a ghostly army marching out of the mist and into history. The ice-choked river continued to flow in the darkness, grinding and crashing, a testament to the barrier they had overcome, while the snow continued to fall, burying their tracks as quickly as they made them, sealing the memory of that night in the cold, white silence of the American winter. The seasons in the New World possess a dramatic rhythm, a cycle of transformation that is nowhere more spectacular than in the vast, rolling wilderness of upstate New York. By the autumn of 1777, the deep green canopy of the summer had begun to turn, shifting slowly into a breathtaking tapestry of russet, gold, and crimson. The air in the Hudson River Valley grew crisp and clear, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the decaying leaves that drifted down from the ancient oaks and maples to carpet the forest floor. It was a landscape of immense, brooding beauty, a place where the silence was deep and old, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rushing waters of the Hudson. But in this particular year, the natural silence was being disturbed by a foreign sound, the grinding, rhythmic noise of a massive machine struggling to move through a world that was not made for it. This was the Grand Army of General John Bergen, a glistening, polished force of British regulars and German mercenaries, moving south from Canada like a slow, heavy river of red and blue, intending to split the rebellious colonies in two. To visualize this army is to see a spectacle of 18th century warfare utterly out of place in the American wild. Bergen, known as Gentleman Johnny, traveled with a baggage train that was miles long, filled with fine china, champagne, and the heavy wardrobes of officers who expected a civilized campaign. But the American wilderness was not civilized. It was a tangle of dense undergrowth, ravines, and swamps. The Americans, under the command of General Philip Schuyler and later Horatio Gates, had engaged in a strategy of delay that was as effective as it was exhausting. They had felled thousands of giant trees across the only available roads, creating a chaotic labyrinth of timber that the British had to hack through, yard by agonizing yard. They destroyed bridges and flooded marshes. The British advance, which had begun with such fanfare and confidence, slowed to a crawl. The soldiers, sweating in their heavy wool uniforms, spent more time wielding axes and shovels than muskets. The forest seemed to be closing in on them, the trees standing like silent sentinels of a land that refused to be conquered. The logistical strain was immense. Supplies were dwindling, and the deeper they pushed into the woods, the more isolated they became. The silence of the forest, once peaceful, began to feel menacing, hiding the eyes of riflemen who watched from the shadows. By September, the two armies converged near a small settlement called Saratoga. The Americans had dug in on a high bluff known as Bemis Heights, a position that commanded the road and the river. Under the direction of the Polish engineer Thaddeus Kosciuszko, they had constructed a formidable line of earthworks and fortifications. They waited there, hidden behind mounds of dirt and logs, a silent, growing force that had been swelled by militia pouring in from the surrounding countryside. These were farmers who had left their harvest to pick up their rifles, men who knew the woods as well as they knew their own backyards. They waited for the British to come to them. The first major confrontation, known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, took place in a clearing surrounded by deep woods. It was a strange, surreal engagement. The British, disciplined and orderly, marched into the clearing in their bright red coats, making perfect targets against the mute colors of the forest. The fighting that ensued was fierce, a swaying back-and-forth struggle where the air became thick with the sulphurous, gray smoke of black powder. The smoke hung low in the humid air, obscuring the trees, creating a fog through which the flashes of musketry appeared like lightning in a storm. The sounds of the battle, the shouting of orders, the screams of horses, the rattle of drums, echoed weirdly off the trunks of the trees, trapped within the canopy. It was a stalemate, but for the British, a stalemate was a defeat. They held the field, but they had lost men they could not replace, while the American ranks grew stronger with every passing day. As October arrived, the situation for Bergen became desperate. The nights grew colder, the frost settling on the tents and the cannons in the morning. The leaves fell faster now, stripping the trees bare, removing the cover, leaving the army exposed to the wind and the enemy. The British were running out of food. The horses were dying. The promise of reinforcements from the south, from General Howe in New York City, had turned out to be a phantom hope. Howe had gone to Philadelphia instead. Bergen was alone, trapped in the deep woods of America, with a starving army and winter approaching. On October 7th, he made one last, desperate attempt to break through the American lines at the Battle of Bami's Heights. It was a futile effort. The Americans, energized by the leadership of Benedict Arnold, who rode across the battlefield like a man possessed, rallying the troops, pushed the British back. The Redcoats retreated to their camp, battered and broken. They began a slow, agonizing withdrawal north to Saratoga, but the trap had snapped shut. The Americans had surrounded them. There was no way out. The days leading up to the surrender were filled with a heavy, pregnant silence. The firing had stopped. The British Army, once the pride of the Empire, lay huddled in their makeshift fortifications, hungry, cold, and demoralized. Negotiations began. Messengers rode back and forth under flags of truce, their horses kicking up the fallen leaves. On October 17, 1777, the unthinkable happened. The British Army surrendered. The scene was one of profound solemnity. On a flat field near the river, under the gray autumn sky, thousands of British and Hessian soldiers marched out to stack their arms. The drums beat a slow, mournful cadence. They laid down their muskets, their cartridge boxes, and their colors. It was performed with a quiet dignity, but the magnitude of the moment was earth-shattering. An entire British field army had been captured by a collection of rebels. This event, taking place in the quiet isolation of the New York wilderness, sent a shockwave that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, rolling like a tsunami towards the courts of Europe. In the gilded palace of Versailles, King Louis XVI of France had been watching the conflict with a cautious eye. He had been secretly sending money and gunpowder, but he had hesitated to openly ally with a losing cause. The news from Saratoga changed everything. It proved that the Americans could fight, that they could win, and that they could sustain a war. The victory in the woods convinced the king to sign the Treaty of Alliance. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was now a world war. France would bring her navy, her money, and her troops to the American shore. But back in Saratoga, as the armies marched away and the winter snow began to fall, the land returned to its ancient rhythm. The smoke of the battle dissipated into the crisp air. The earthworks slowly began to erode under the rain and the wind. The forest, indifferent to the quarrels of men, began to reclaim the clearing at Freeman's Farm. Saplings sprouted where soldiers had fallen. The silence returned, deep and abiding, covering the scars of the conflict under a blanket of white snow. The turning of the tide had happened not with a crash, but with the slow, steady accumulation of resolve, much like the changing of the seasons themselves. The river flowed on, the trees stood watch, and the history of the world had pivoted on a few crisp autumn days in the American woods. The euphoria of the autumn victory at Saratoga, where the leaves had turned gold and the British had laid down their arms, slowly faded as the year 1777 drew to its close. The vibrant colors of the fall were stripped away by the biting winds of November and December, leaving the world a skeleton of gray branches and frozen earth. In Pennsylvania, the Continental Army, the very force that carried the fragile hopes of independence, was not marching in triumph. It was trudging, defeated and exhausted, away from the warmth of the cities and into the desolate, rolling hills of the countryside. They had lost the capital. Philadelphia was now in the hands of the British, a city of warm hearths, brick houses, and well-stocked pantries. While the British officers danced in ballrooms and slept in feather beds, George Washington led his 11,000 men to a place called Valley Forge. It was a plateau of high ground, defensible but bleak, a place where the wind swept down from the hills with no obstacle to break its force. As the army arrived in mid-December, the ground was hard as iron, and the air held the metallic tang of snow that was yet to fall but hung heavy in the gray sky. To understand Valley Forge is not to picture a battle, for there was no fighting here, no cannons roaring, no charges of cavalry. It was a siege of nature, a war against the elements where the enemy was the frost, the hunger, and the crushing weight of boredom and despair. The first order of business was survival. The soldiers, many of them wearing coats that had been stitched together from blankets, or wearing remnants of uniforms that had long since lost their color, began the work of building a city of logs. It was a scene of slow, rhythmic labor. The sound of axes biting into the wood echoed through the cold air. Thwack, 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 a dull, repetitive percussion that defined the daylight hours. Trees were felled, stripped of their branches, and dragged through the snow. Slowly, row by row, a grid of small log huts began to rise. These were not grand structures. They were small, cramped cabins, 14 feet by 16 feet, designed to house 12 men each. The chinking between the logs was filled with mud and clay to keep out the wind, but as the mud froze and cracked, the drafts would whistle through, carrying the biting cold into the only shelter these men had. By January, the snow had come in earnest. It fell not in the playful flurries of early winter, but in heavy, relentless sheets that blanketed the camp in white. The world of Valley Forge became a study in monochrome. The sky was a flat sheet of slate gray, the ground was a blinding, undulating ocean of white, and the trees were black charcoal sketches etched against the horizon. The silence of the snow was profound. It muffled the footsteps of the sentries, it dampened the sounds of the camp, creating a hushed, cathedral-like atmosphere that belied the suffering within. Inside the huts, the air was thick with smoke. The fireplaces were often poorly constructed, and the green wood hissed and smoked rather than burned, filling the small spaces with a stinging haze that made eyes water and lungs cough. 12 men would huddle together on the earthen floor, sharing body heat, wrapped in whatever rags they possessed. For many, there were no blankets. For some, there were no shoes. The bloody footprints in the snow, often cited in history books, were a literal reality here. Men wrapped their feet in burlap sacks or pieces of raw hide, shuffling through the drifts to stand guard, their breath pluming in the frigid air like steam from a kettle. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, a dull ache in the belly that never went away. The supply lines had broken down. The wagons were stuck in the snow or simply never came. The diet of the army was reduced to a monotonous, flavorless paste known as fire cake, a mixture of flour and water. Baked on a hot stone or in the ashes of the fire until it was hard enough to break a tooth. It had no taste, no nutrition, only the ability to briefly stop the pangs of an empty stomach. Meat was a rarity. On the days when a scrawny cow was butchered, every part was used, boiled into a thin, watery broth that was drank with reverence. The men moved slowly, conserving their energy. Conversations were low and sporadic. The energy for anger or rebellion had been sapped by the cold. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the sun to set so they could sleep, and then waiting for the sun to rise so they could see if they had survived the night. Washington, the tall Virginian, remained with his men. He did not retreat to a comfortable farmhouse miles away. He stayed in a small stone house at the edge of the camp, working by candlelight late into the night. He rode through the camp daily on his white horse, a silent, stoic figure wrapped in a blue cloak. He saw the suffering. He saw the men without shirts, their skin blue with cold. He saw the sentries standing on their hats in the snow to keep their bare feet off the ice. He wrote letters to Congress, letters that were not angry shouts but desperate, reasoned pleas for help, describing an army that was on the verge of starving, dissolving, or dispersing. The weight of the revolution rested entirely on his shoulders in these dark months. He bore it with a quiet dignity, a reserve that became the anchor for the entire army. There is a legend of Washington kneeling in prayer in the snow, asking for divine intervention. Whether it happened or not is less important than the image it evokes, a solitary leader in the vast, white silence of the winter woods, seeking strength in the stillness. As February arrived, the winter deepened, but a new figure appeared in the camp, a man who would bring a different kind of rhythm to the frozen days. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a chest full of medals and a broken grasp of the English language, rode into Valley Forge. He did not bring food or blankets, he brought discipline. In the midst of the snow, on a parade ground cleared by exhausted men, he began to drill the army. It was a surreal sight. A German baron shouting orders in a mix of French, German, and broken English, teaching American farmers how to march in step. But it worked. The drilling gave the men something to do, a purpose that cut through the boredom and the misery. Left, right, left, right. The sound of hundreds of boots hitting the frozen ground in unison began to create a new heartbeat for the camp. He taught them how to load their muskets quickly, how to use the bayonet, how to wheel from a column into a line. The repetition was hypnotic. It was a slow, methodical transformation. The ragged, shivering collection of individuals was being forged, hammered by the cold and the drill into a unified machine. The steam of their breath rose in rhythm with their movements. The clack-clack of the muskets being shouldered echoed off the trees. The winter dragged on, seemingly endless. The days were short, the nights interminably long. Disease stalked the camp: typhus, typhoid, dysentery. The hospital huts were places of quiet tragedy, where men slipped away in the dark, their battles over. 2,000 men died at Valley Forge, not from British bullets but from the silent killers of the winter. And yet the army did not dissolve. They did not mutiny. There was a profound, stubborn resilience in these men. They stayed because of a shared belief, a bond formed in the suffering. They told stories by the smoky fires. They mended their clothes for the 100th time. They watched the snow pile up against the logs, and they waited. They knew that just 20 miles away, the British were warm and fed, and that knowledge hardened their resolve like ice. They were enduring for a future they could barely imagine, a spring that felt a lifetime away. Finally, slowly, imperceptibly, the grip of the winter began to loosen. The sun lingered a few minutes longer in the sky each day. The icicles hanging from the eaves of the huts began to drip, 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 a countdown to the end of the ordeal. The snow turned to slush, the slush to mud. The river began to flow freely again, the ice breaking up with loud cracks that sounded like cannon fire. In May, the news arrived that France had officially joined the war. The alliance was real. The suffering had not been in vain. A celebration was held, a feu de joie, or fire of joy. The men, now trained, disciplined, and survivors of the worst nature could throw at them, lined up in perfect formation. They fired their muskets into the air, a rolling volley that rippled down the lines, a thunderous shout of defiance and survival. The army that marched out of Valley Forge in June of 1778 was not the same army that had stumbled in 6 months earlier. The fat had been burned away by hunger, the weakness had been frozen out by the cold. What remained was muscle, bone, and iron will. They moved with a new cadence, the confident stride of professionals. The long winter had been a crucible. It was a time of silence, of waiting, of enduring the dark so that they could be ready for the light. As they left the log city behind, leaving the empty huts to rot slowly back into the earth, the valley returned to its natural quiet. The wind still blew through the trees, but the axes were silent, the fires were out, and the snow had melted into the soil, watering the roots of a nation that had learned, in the deepest cold, how to survive. The ghosts of the winter receded, leaving only the memory of the white silence and the unshakable patience of those who waited for the spring. Far from the frozen hills of Valley Forge and the rocky coastlines of New England, the war for American independence found a new and dramatically different stage as the 1770s bled into the 1780s. The British High Command, frustrated by the stalemate in the north, turned their gaze southward, toward the wealthy colonies of Georgia and the Carolinas. They believed that here, among the rice plantations and the indigo fields, they would find a population loyal to the king. And so, the theater of conflict shifted. It moved from the crisp, clear air of the northern woodlands to a landscape that was heavy, ancient, and teeming with a quiet, hostile life of its own. To understand this phase of the war, one must close their eyes and imagine the heat, a wet, suffocating blanket of humidity that descended upon the land in May and did not lift until October. It was a heat that pressed against the skin, that slowed the breath, and turned the simple act of marching into an exhausting ordeal. The British Army, disciplined and regimental, arrived in this world with their heavy wool uniforms and their precise formations. They captured the port city of Charleston in a siege that was methodical and crushing, and for a moment, it seemed that the South was lost. They began to march inland, their columns of red snaking through the sandy pine barrens and the open fields. But as they pushed deeper into the interior of South Carolina, the geography began to change. The solid ground gave way to the lowcountry, a vast, watery labyrinth of cypress swamps, tidal creeks, and marshes. This was a world where the boundary between land and water was blurred, where the earth was soft and sucking, and where the air buzzed with the ceaseless drone of mosquitoes and cicadas. It was a landscape of shadows. Giant live oak trees, centuries old, spread their massive limbs across the sky, draped in long, gray curtains of Spanish moss that swayed gently in the stagnant breeze. To the soldiers marching beneath them, these trees looked like ghosts, silent sentinels watching their every move. In this environment, the traditional rules of European warfare dissolved into the mud. The British could not form their neat lines of battle here. The roads were narrow tracks that disappeared into the water. The heat sapped the strength of the men and the horses, and in this green, tangled twilight, a new kind of enemy emerged. They were not the uniformed soldiers of the Continental Army who stood in rows to exchange volleys. They were the militia of the marshes, men who lived in the saddle, who knew every hidden path, every dry hummock, and every ford in the river. They did not fight to hold territory. They fought to harass, to exhaust, and to terrify. Leading them was a man who would become a legend of the shadows, a quiet, unassuming planter named Francis Marion. Marion was not a giant of a man like Washington. He was small, wiry, and silent, with a knee that had been broken and set crookedly, but in the swamps he was a phantom. The British cavalry officer, Banastre Tarleton, famously cursed him, saying that the devil himself could not catch him, giving Marion the name that history would remember, the Swamp Fox. Marion's base of operations was Snow's Island, a remote, inaccessible piece of high ground deep within the P.D. River swamp. It was a natural fortress, surrounded by miles of black water and dense cane brakes. Here, beneath the canopy of cypress and tupelo trees, his men would gather. They were a motley collection of farmers, free blacks, and Catawba Indians. They wore no uniforms, only the rough, homespun clothes of the frontier. They carried rifles, not muskets, and they rode on small, sure-footed marsh ponies that could navigate the mud better than the heavy British chargers. The rhythm of the war in the southern marshlands was not one of great, thundering battles, but of silence and sudden violence. Imagine the British columns moving slowly through the heat of the afternoon. The sun beats down on their red coats, the sweat trickling down their backs. The air is still, heavy with the scent of pluff mud and rotting vegetation. The only sounds are the creaking of the leather saddles, the jingle of the harness, and the buzz of the horseflies. The soldiers are tired, thirsty, and on edge. They scan the tree line, but they see nothing but the wall of green palmettos and the hanging moss. Then from the silence, a whistle mimics the call of a marsh bird. Suddenly, the trees seem to come alive. A volley of rifle fire erupts from the shadows, not a massive roar, but a sharp, cracking dissonance. Men fall. Horses rear in panic, splashing into the murky water of the roadside ditches. And then, just as quickly as it began, the firing stops. By the time the British can form a line and charge into the woods, the enemy is gone. Marion and his men have vanished back into the swamp, slipping away on hidden paths that only they know, leaving behind only the smoke and the silence. These guerrilla tactics were a war of nerves. The British soldiers began to fear the night. They felt watched. The swamp felt like a living entity that was conspiring against them. At night, the marshes came alive with a different chorus. The bullfrogs bellowed from the water's edge, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the chest. The owls called to one another in the dark, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" their voices echoing through the timber. To a young soldier from London or the English countryside, these sounds were alien and terrifying. They sat by their campfires, staring into the black wall of the forest, wondering if the swamp fox was out there, watching, and he usually was. Marion's men moved at night, paddling silent flat-bottomed boats down the black rivers, the oars muffled, the water rippling quietly against the hull. They would strike a supply convoy, burn the wagons, seize the ammunition, and disappear before dawn, melting away like the morning mist. The war here was slow, grinding, and personal. It was a war of attrition played out in a landscape of immense beauty and danger. The heat was relentless. It warped the wood of the wagons, it soured the food, it bred fevers that laid men low by the hundreds. The British were fighting not just a rebellion, but the land itself. General Cornwallis, the British commander, found his army slowly being bled dry. He could conquer a city, he could march his army across the map, but he could not control the countryside. The ground he walked on was solid, but the ground around him was fluid, shifting, and hostile. The Southern strategy was sinking into the mud of the Santee and the PD rivers. One specific engagement captures the essence of this sleeping history. It was not a battle, but an escape. Tarleton, the aggressive British commander, had been chasing Marion for days. They rode hard, covering miles of difficult terrain. The British horses, bred for the open fields of Europe, began to falter in the thick mud and the tangle of vines. Marion led them deeper and deeper into the heart of the swamp, through creeks where the water came up to the saddle girths, through thickets of briar that tore at the uniforms. Finally, they reached the edge of the Ox Swamp. It was a dark, impenetrable morass, a place where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun. Marion and his men rode straight into it without hesitating, their marsh ponies picking their way over the submerged roots. Tarleton stopped at the edge. He looked into the gloom, where the gray moss hung like cobwebs and the water lay black and still. He realized he could not follow. He turned his horse around, exhausted and defeated by the geography. The swamp had protected its own. As the months dragged on, the war in the southern marshlands became a stalemate of exhaustion. The British controlled the ground they stood on and nothing more. The Americans controlled the silence, the shadows, and the night. The humidity continued to rise, the cicadas continued their deafening afternoon song, and the slow, dark rivers continued to flow towards the sea, carrying with them the secrets of a war fought not in the open, but in the hidden places. The psychological toll was immense. The British army was being hollowed out from the inside, tired of chasing ghosts, tired of the mud, tired of a land that seemed to reject them. This southern campaign, slow and suffocating, set the stage for the final act. It forced Cornwallis to move north, to seek a deep-water port where he could be resupplied and rested. He would move towards a quiet tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. But for now, the story rests in the humid embrace of the Carolinas, where the history is written in the water and the wind, and where the swamp fox still rides in the imagination. A silent guardian of the marsh, waiting in the stillness of the trees. While the humid heat of the southern marshlands was sapping the strength of the British army, and the guerrilla fighters of Francis Marion were fading into the cypress shadows. A different kind of darkness was gathering far to the north, along the majestic, rocky banks of the Hudson River. The year was 1780. The war had dragged on for 5 long, exhausting years. The initial spark of enthusiasm that had ignited the colonies in 1775 had long since settled into a grim, grinding endurance. In the Hudson Highlands of New York, the great river cut a deep channel through granite hills. A strategic artery that was considered the key to the continent. Overlooking this vital waterway sat the fortress of West Point. It was a formidable complex of stone forts, redoubts, and a massive iron chain stretched across the river to block enemy ships. To the eye, West Point was the symbol of American strength and defiance, a rock against which the waves of British power would break. But inside the headquarters of the fort's commander, a rot had set in that was far more dangerous than any cannonball. The fortress was strong, but the man holding the key was broken. Major General Benedict Arnold sat in the study of the Robinson House, a comfortable estate situated on the eastern bank of the river, just opposite the fortress. Outside the window, the Hudson flowed with a heavy, relentless power, its waters gray and cold under the September sky. Arnold watched the river, his face a mask of brooding resentment. He was, by all accounts, a hero. It was Arnold who had led the grueling march through the wilderness of Maine to Quebec. It was Arnold who had built a fleet of ships from Greenwood to stop the British on Lake Champlain. And it was Arnold who had ridden like a demon across the battlefield at Saratoga, leading the charge that broke the British line and turned the tide of the war. But the cost had been high. His left leg, shattered by a musket ball at Quebec and then wounded again at Saratoga, was a constant source of agony. It was inch shorter than the other, leaving him with a limp that served as a daily reminder of his sacrifice. But the pain in his leg was nothing compared to the pain in his pride. As he sat there, the scratching of his quill pen on parchment was the only sound in the room. He felt unappreciated. He felt that while he had bled for the cause, lesser men, politicians in Philadelphia and officers with better connections, were reaping the rewards. He had been passed over for promotion. He had been investigated for financial irregularities. He had been reprimanded by George Washington, the man he admired most. The bitterness had accumulated slowly, drop by drop, like water wearing away a stone, until it had created a hollow space where his patriotism used to be. In that hollow space, a new idea had taken root: betrayal. It was not a sudden decision, but a slow drift, a rationalization that perhaps the war was a mistake, that the alliance with Catholic France was a sin, and that bringing the colonies back to the British Empire would be an act of statesmanship, not treason. And of course there was the money. Arnold was deeply in debt, living a lifestyle he could not afford with his young, beautiful, and loyalist-leaning wife, Peggy Shippen. The British offered him £20,000, a fortune, and a commission as a brigadier general in their army. All he had to do was sell them West Point. The correspondence had been going on for over a year. It was a dance of shadows, conducted through letters written in code, using invisible ink that only appeared when treated with acid or heat. Arnold used the pseudonym Gustavus, and his British handler, the charming and artistic Major John Andre, used the name John Anderson. These letters traveled through the lines, carried by women. By spies, by unsuspecting messengers, weaving a web of deceit that spanned the neutral ground between the armies. Imagine the tension in that room as Arnold wrote those letters. He was a man walking on a razor's edge. Every knock at the door, every look from an aide, sent a spike of adrenaline through his veins. He was selling the fortress, the garrison, the artillery, and potentially George Washington himself, who was scheduled to visit. He was plotting the death of the nation he had helped to birth. By late September, the plot was ripe. A meeting was necessary to finalize the details. On the night of September 21st, the moon was obscured by clouds, casting the Hudson River into a deep, velvety darkness. A British sloop of war, the Vulture, lay anchored quietly in the river, its masts barely visible against the night sky. From the western shore, a small boat rowed out with muffled oars to fetch Major Andre. He was brought to a secluded spot in the woods near Haverstraw, a place where the hemlock trees grew thick and the shadows were impenetrable. There in the damp chill of the riverbank, the two conspirators met face to face for the first time. Arnold, the limping, bitter general, and Andre, the young, poetic officer. They spoke in hushed tones, huddled in the dark, exchanging maps and documents. Arnold gave Andre the plans of the fortifications, the placement of the cannons, and the minutes of the confidential councils of war. He told him that Washington would be at West Point in a few days. It was the perfect trap. The meeting lasted too long. Dawn began to break, turning the sky a pale, treacherous gray. The boatmen refused to row Andre back to the Vulture in the daylight, especially after American troops on the shore began firing at the ship, forcing it to drop downriver. Andre was stranded. He was trapped behind enemy lines. Arnold, panicked but practical, gave him a pass to get through the checkpoints and sent him on a dangerous overland journey back to New York City. Before they parted, Arnold made a fatal suggestion. He told Andre to hide the incriminating papers inside his boot, beneath his stocking. It was a classic mistake, putting physical evidence on his person, but the stress of the night had clouded their judgment. Andre set out on his horse. He changed his British uniform for civilian clothes, a maroon coat and a round hat, stripping away the protection of being a prisoner of war if caught. He was now a spy. He rode through the neutral ground of Westchester County, a lawless, dangerous area plagued by bandits and roving patrols. He was so close to safety. He could almost smell the salt air of British-held New York, but fate, as it often does in these stories, intervened in the most mundane way. Near the village of Tarrytown, 3 militiamen were lounging under a tulip tree, playing cards, waiting to stop travelers. They stopped Andre. It should have been a routine check. Andre, confused by their uniforms, or lack thereof, made a mistake. He assumed they were loyalists. He said, "Gentlemen, I hope you belong to our party." When they asked which party, he said, "The lower party," meaning the British. It was the slip of the tongue that changed history. The men seized him, they searched him, they pulled off his boots, and there, nestled against the sole of his foot, were the papers in Benedict Arnold's handwriting. The news of the capture traveled slowly, confusedly. The papers were sent to Washington, who was en route to West Point, but the initial report of the capture was sent to Benedict Arnold. It was a bureaucratic error, a courtesy to the commander. On the morning of September 25th, Arnold was sitting at his breakfast table at the Robinson house. It was a pleasant morning. The windows were open to the river. He was expecting General Washington at any moment for breakfast. His wife Peggy was at the table, as were his aides. Then, a messenger arrived with a letter. Arnold broke the wax seal. As he read the words stating that a John Anderson had been captured with plans of West Point in his boot, the blood must have drained from his face. The room must have spun. The floor must have felt like it was dropping away. He sat there, in the center of his domestic life, realizing that the axe had fallen. He did not scream. He did not flip the table. He maintained a terrifying, icy calm. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He told his aides that he had been called to West Point urgently to prepare for Washington's reception. He went upstairs to his bedroom, told his wife the truth, that he was a lost man, and left her fainting on the floor. He walked out of the house, limping down the path to the river where his official barge was waiting. He ordered the rowers to row him not to West Point, but downriver to the Vulture. He told them it was a special mission. The men, unsuspecting, put their backs into the oars. Arnold sat in the stern, his pistols primed, watching the shores of the country he was leaving forever glide by. He passed the fortress he had tried to sell. He passed the flag he had bled for. As he boarded the British ship, he was safe, but he was utterly alone. He had traded his honor for a pension and a life of eternal scorn. Washington arrived at the Robinson house shortly after Arnold had left. He ate the breakfast prepared for the traitor. He crossed the river to inspect the fort, puzzled by Arnold's absence. When the packet of papers from Andre finally arrived in the afternoon, the truth was revealed. Washington, a man who rarely showed emotion, was shaken to his core. He had trusted Arnold. He had defended him. He looked at his young aide, Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette, and asked the question that resonated with a profound, sorrowful weight. Arnold has betrayed us. Whom can we trust now? The shadow of betrayal hung heavy over the camp that night. Security was tightened. Couriers were dispatched, but the damage was psychological. If the hero of Saratoga could turn, anyone could. The execution of Major Andre a few weeks later was a grim affair. He was hanged as a spy, though many on the American side admired his courage and regretted the necessity of his death. Arnold lived, but he lived as a man without a country, despised by the Americans and untrusted by the British, who never gave him a field command of importance. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, a man haunted by the ghost of his own reputation. As the autumn leaves fell in the Hudson Highlands that year, they covered the ground where the conspiracy had been hatched. The river continued to flow, cold and indifferent, past the granite cliffs of West Point. The fortress had been saved, not by brilliance, but by the chance meeting of 3 militiamen under a tulip tree. The shadows of betrayal had lengthened, threatening to swallow the revolution whole, but they had been dispelled at the last moment, leaving the Americans shaken, wary, but still standing. The war would go on, but the innocence was gone. The revolution had looked into the abyss of treason and seen the face of one of its own sons. The autumn of 1781 arrived in Virginia with a golden, hazy warmth, a softness that settled over the tobacco fields and the tidal rivers like a lingering memory of summer. It was October, the month of harvest, when the earth usually yielded its fruits to the farmer, but in this singular year, the harvest would be of a different kind. On the narrow peninsula formed by the York and James rivers, the final, decisive act of the American Revolution was preparing to unfold, not with a sudden crash, but with the slow, crushing inevitability of a closing vice. General Lord Cornwallis, the commander who had marched so confidently through the southern marshlands, had brought his army to the sleepy tobacco port of Yorktown. He had come to rest, to refit, and to wait for the British Navy to whisk him away to safety. But the sea, usually the lifeline of the British Empire, had turned against him. The French fleet under the Comte de Grasse had sealed the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, their tall masts standing like a forest of bars across the prison door. And from the land, marching down the dusty roads from the north, came the combined armies of George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau. The trap, years in the making, had finally snapped shut. The Siege of Yorktown was a masterpiece of 18th century engineering, a war of geometry and mathematics played out on a canvas of earth and sand. It was not a chaotic brawl, it was a slow, methodical strangulation. When the Allied forces arrived, they did not charge the British lines in a wave of shouting men, they simply stopped. They encamped in a vast semicircle around the town, their tents glowing like pale ghosts in the twilight. The air was filled with a strange, heavy anticipation. The British were trapped against the river, their backs to the water, looking out at a horizon that was slowly filling with the flags of their enemies. The real work began at night. To approach the British fortifications, the earthen walls and redoubts bristling with cannon, the Allies had to dig. On the dark, moonless night of October 6th, thousands of men picked up shovels and pickaxes. They moved out into the open ground between the armies, a space known as no man's land, under the strictest orders for silence, no talking, no smoking. No clanking of metal, they began to break the earths. Imagine the sound of that night. It was not the roar of battle, but the rhythmic, muffled sound of steel biting into soil. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. It was the heartbeat of the siege. A heavy rain began to fall, soaking the men to the bone, but it was a blessing, for the sound of the rain masked the noise of the digging. All through the night, the French and American soldiers labored, digging a trench or a parallel that ran for nearly 2,000 yards. They worked with the desperate energy of men who knew that when the sun rose, they would be exposed. When the dawn of October 7th broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gray, the British sentries on the walls of Yorktown looked out in disbelief. Where there had been an empty field the night before, there was now a long, fresh scar of earth, a trench deep enough to hide a man and wide enough to move cannons. The Allies had effectively moved their entire army hundreds of yards closer in a single night, and they were now protected by a wall of dirt. The British opened fire with their artillery, but the earthen walls absorbed the cannonballs with a dull thud. The siege had truly begun. 2 days later, the Allied guns were in place. At 3:00 p.m. on October 9th, the bombardment commenced. Washington himself fired the first American gun. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the ground and sent flocks of waterfowl rising in panic from the marshes. But as the day turned into night, the bombardment transformed from a terrifying noise into a spectacle of terrible, hypnotic beauty. This is where the siege under the stars truly began. The mortars, short-barreled cannons designed to lob shells high into the air, began their work. To a soldier lying in the trenches, or to a civilian watching from a distance, the night sky over Yorktown became a theater of fire. The fuse of a mortar shell burned with a bright, sputtering tail. When fired, these shells would arc high into the black velvet of the heavens, tracing long, glowing parabolas that looked like slow-moving meteors. They would climb up, hanging for a moment among the true stars, Polaris, Cassiopeia, Orion, before beginning their descent. It was a dance of destruction. The shells would whistle as they fell, a high-pitched shriek that ended in a flash of orange light and a thunderous explosion within the British lines. An American surgeon, James Thacher, watched this display and wrote that the shells looked like fiery meteors with long tails, most beautifully brilliant. It was a paradox of war. The visual experience was serene, almost majestic, while the reality on the ground was one of horror. The town of Yorktown was being pulverized. Houses were crumbling, ships in the harbor were set on fire, their burning hulks casting a blood-red reflection on the dark waters of the York River. The ground shook with a constant, rhythmic trembling, as if the earth itself was shivering. The air became thick with the smell of sulfur, burnt wood, and the damp, salty fog of the river. As the days and nights wore on, the Allies dug a second parallel, moving even closer. The noose was tightening. The British army was being squeezed into a smaller and smaller box. They were running out of food. They were running out of ammunition. Disease, smallpox, was rampant in the town. They were living in caves dug into the riverbank to escape the relentless rain of iron from the sky. But two obstacles remained, redoubts number 9 and number 10. These were two small, detached forts that blocked the completion of the second trench. To finish the siege, they had to be taken. On the night of October 14th, the order was given. It would be a bayonet attack carried out under the cover of darkness. The Americans, led by a young and ambitious Alexander Hamilton, would take Redoubt 10. The the French would take Redoubt 9. The soldiers were ordered to unload their muskets. There would be no firing, no flashes of light to give away their position. The work would be done with cold steel. The night was pitch black, the air heavy with mist. The columns of men moved forward silently, their boots sinking into the soft sand. They could hear the British sentries calling out, "All's well," unaware that hundreds of men were creeping towards them in the dark. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The sappers, the engineers with axes, began to hack through the wooden abattis, the barrier of sharpened logs surrounding the fort. The British opened fire. The night erupted in flashes of musketry. But the Americans did not stop to shoot back. They swarmed over the walls, shouting the watchword Rochambeau, which in the chaos sounded like "Rush on, boys." It was a flurry of activity, brief and intense, fought in the shadows. Within 10 minutes it was over. The British surrendered the forts. The French, fighting with equal bravery nearby, took their objective as well. The last locks on the door had been broken. With the capture of the redoubts, the Allies brought their cannons to within point-blank range. The bombardment that followed was apocalyptic. It was no longer a siege, it was an execution. The British position was untenable. Cornwallis looked out at the river, hoping to escape to the other side, but a sudden squall, a storm of wind and rain, scattered his boats. The elements once again had conspired against him. He was trapped, he was alone. The sky above him was filled with the fiery arcs of the mortar shells, a relentless 24-hour thunderstorm of iron. On the morning of October 17th, the 4th anniversary of the victory at Saratoga, the guns suddenly fell silent. The smoke, which had hung over the peninsula like a shroud for weeks, began to drift away on the breeze. A single British drummer boy appeared on the parapet of the hornwork. He beat a rhythm, but in the roar of the lingering echoes, no one could hear it. Then, a British officer appeared waving a white handkerchief. The firing ceased completely. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was louder than the cannons. The crickets began to chirp again. The birds returned to the sky. The groans of the wounded and the lapping of the river water against the shore were the only sounds remaining. The siege under the stars was over. The great machinery of war, which had churned and ground its way across the continent for 8 years, finally ground to a halt in a tobacco field in Virginia. The nights that followed were quiet. The mortar shells no longer traced their beautiful, deadly arcs across the heavens. The stars looked down on a changed world. The campfires of the Allied army burned bright, a ring of victory surrounding the darkened, ruined town. The soldiers, exhausted, dirty, and triumphant, slept the deep sleep of men who knew that the end had finally come. They had fought under the sun and under the stars, in the snow and in the swamp, and now, under the vast, peaceful canopy of the Virginia night, they could finally rest. The story of the Revolution was drawing to its close, leaving behind the silence of the battlefield and the enduring light of a new nation. The smoke from the artillery at Yorktown had long since dissipated, carried away by the winds of the Atlantic, but the war did not end with the sudden silence of the guns. It lingered, stretching out into a long, uncertain twilight that lasted for 2 agonizing years. While the soldiers in America waited in their camps, bored and restless, wondering if the fighting would start again, the true final battle was being fought in the quiet, elegant rooms of Paris. It was a battle not of swords, but of words, not of gunpowder, but of ink. The city of Paris in the early 1780s was a world away from the mud and the swamps of the American colonies. It was a city of cobblestones and gas lamps, of gilded carriages and powdered wigs, where the air smelled of perfume and roasting chestnuts rather than wood smoke and fear. In the Hotel de York, situated in the Latin Quarter, the American commissioners, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, gathered to hammer out the terms of existence for their new nation. Imagine the atmosphere of those rooms. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn to keep out the chill of the Seine. The fire crackled softly in the marble hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the tapestries that lined the walls. The process was maddeningly slow. Diplomacy in the 18th century was a game of patience, a chess match played via letters that took weeks to cross the ocean. Benjamin Franklin, now an old man, weary and suffering from gout, sat in his chair, his spectacles perched on his nose, playing the role of the wise philosopher. He charmed the French, he maneuvered around the British, and he kept the fragile coalition together with his wit and his silence. John Adams, stiff and irritable, paced the floor. anxious to secure the rights to the fisheries of New England, arguing over every comma and clause. John Jay, suspicious and sharp, watched the maps, ensuring that the borders of the United States would stretch all the way to the Mississippi River. Months turned into seasons. The spring of 1782 gave way to summer, and summer to autumn. They sat at tables covered in green baize cloth, dipping their quill pens into silver inkstands, drafting and redrafting the articles of peace. The scratching of the pen against the parchment was the sound of a new map being drawn. Scratch, 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 a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that was carving a country out of the wilderness. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the work was done. The Treaty of Paris was ready for signature. The British delegate, David Hartley, sat opposite the Americans. There was no fanfare, no cheering crowds. Just a few men in a quiet room, signing their names to a document that acknowledged the United States of America as free, sovereign, and independent. The ink dried slowly on the page, sealing the fate of millions. The painter Benjamin West tried to capture this moment on canvas, but the British delegates refused to pose, leaving the painting forever unfinished, a blank space in history that speaks to the reluctance of an empire to let go. With the signing of the parchment, the focus shifted back across the ocean to the city of New York. The British Army, which had occupied the city for 7 long years, prepared to leave. November 25, 1783 was known as Evacuation Day. It was a day of cold, crisp air and bright sunlight. The British ships, their holds packed with soldiers and loyalists, pulled away from the wharves. As they left, a final, petty act of defiance occurred. A British gunner had greased the flagpole at the battery and knocked off the cleats, leaving the Union Jack flying at the top with no way to pull it down. But an American sailor, armed with cleats and a hammer, climbed the slippery pole, tore down the British flag, and raised the stars and stripes. The cloth snapped in the wind, a sound of finality. The redcoats were gone, the city was quiet, the war was physically over. But for George Washington, one last, painful duty remained. He had to say goodbye. On December 4th, he entered the long room of Fraunce's Tavern in Lower Manhattan. The room is still there today, a place of wood and brick and memory. His officers were waiting for him, men like Henry Knox, Baron von Steuben, and Nathanael Greene. These were men who had shivered with him at Valley Forge, who had crossed the Delaware in the ice, who had sweated in the heat of Monmouth. They stood in silence as he entered. Washington was not a man given to public displays of emotion. He was a statue of reserve, but as he looked at the faces of his military family, his composure cracked. He filled a glass of wine and raised it with a trembling hand. His voice, usually so steady, was choked with tears. "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you," he said softly. "I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." He drank the wine and set the glass down. He then asked each man to come forward and take his hand. Henry Knox, the burly artilleryman, was the first. Washington, unable to speak, gripped his hand and then, in a moment of rare intimacy, embraced him. Knox wept openly. One by one, the officers came forward. There were no speeches. The silence in the room was heavy, filled only with the sound of boots shuffling on the floorboards and the stifled sobs of hardened soldiers. It was a scene of profound sorrow, the breaking of a brotherhood forged in fire. When it was over, Washington turned and walked out of the room. He walked through a line of light infantry to a waiting barge at Whitehall. He boarded the boat, took off his hat, and waved a silent farewell as the rowers pulled him out into the Hudson River. He was leaving the army. He was leaving the power. He rode south towards Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress was meeting. His journey was not a victory lap, but a pilgrimage of peace. He arrived at the Maryland State House just before Christmas. On December 23rd, the final act of his public life was set to take place. The Senate chamber was packed. The delegates sat with their hats on, a symbol that the civil authority was superior to the military. Washington stood before them, holding his speech in his hand. His hand shook so much that he had to hold the paper with both hands to read it. He spoke of his reluctance to accept the command years ago and his gratitude for the support he had received. And then he delivered the lines that would secure his place in history as the American Cincinnatus, the man who conquered but refused to rule. "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action," he said. "I here offer my commission." and take my leave of all the employments of public life." He drew the parchment of his commission from his coat pocket, the same paper that had been given to him in Philadelphia 8 years earlier, and handed it to the President of the Congress. It was a simple gesture, the passing of a piece of paper, but it carried the weight of a world. In that moment, he ceased to be General Washington. He became simply Mr. Washington. The room was silent, awestruck by the magnitude of the surrender. He bowed to the Congress, and they bowed back. He left the State House and mounted his horse. It was Christmas Eve. The road to Mount Vernon lay ahead. He rode through the winter landscape of Maryland and Virginia, the rhythm of his horse's hooves on the frozen ground, marking the final miles of his long odyssey. The sun set early, casting long purple shadows across the fields. He rode into the twilight, a solitary figure in a blue cloak. He was not thinking of battles or strategy or logistics. He was thinking of his own vine and fig tree, of the warmth of his own hearth, and of the quiet life he had yearned for. As darkness fell, the lights of Mount Vernon appeared through the trees. The dogs began to bark, sensing his arrival. The door opened, spilling yellow candlelight onto the snow. Martha was waiting. He dismounted, handing the reins to a servant. He walked up the steps, his boots echoing on the porch. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him, shutting out the cold, shutting out the world, shutting out the war. The parchment of peace had been signed, the sword had been sheathed, and the soldier was home. The house was quiet, filled with the smell of pine and beeswax. Outside, the Potomac River flowed silently towards the sea, carrying the history of the Revolution away into the past, leaving behind a nation that could finally, after 8 long years, close its eyes and sleep in peace. The sun rose over the United States of America on the morning after the peace, not with a trumpet blast, but with the quiet, steady light that has touched this continent for millennia. The long, tumultuous storm of the Revolution had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a silence that felt new and profound. It was a silence that stretched from the granite cliffs of New Hampshire, down through the bustling wharves of Philadelphia, across the red clay fields of Virginia, and into the deep green marshes of Georgia. The guns were cold, the flags were furled. The marching boots that had tramped across the mud of 7 fateful years were now resting by the hearths of farmhouses, slowly gathering dust. The history books would record the dates and the treaties, but the true story of the ending was written in the land itself, and in the return of the natural rhythm of life that had been interrupted by the chaos of war. As the seasons turned in the years following the peace, nature began its slow, patient work of healing. In the fields of Lexington and Concord, where the first shots had cracked the morning air, the grass grew tall and green, swaying in the gentle breeze. The stone walls that had once served as breastworks for desperate militia men were now just boundaries for cattle and sheep, covered in moss and lichen. In the deep woods of Saratoga, the clearing at Freeman's Farm, once choked with the smoke of black powder, was reclaimed by the forest. Saplings of oak and maple pushed up through the soil, reaching for the sunlight, their roots weaving through the earth where armies had once clashed. The birds returned to the trees, their songs replacing the rattle of drums. The scars of the trenches at Yorktown were softened by the rain and the wind, slowly filling with wildflowers, goldenrod and aster, turning the instruments of war into a garden of peace. The earth remembered, but it also forgave, covering the violence with a blanket of living green. The people, too, returned to the rhythms of the days and the seasons. The soldier who had shivered at Valley Forge and marched through the heat of Monmouth put down his musket and picked up the handle of the plow. The sensation of the wood in his hands was different now. It was the tool of creation, not destruction. He looked at the furrowed earth not as a terrain to be defended, but as a seedbed for the future. In the blacksmith shops, the hammers rang out against the anvils, clang, 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 no longer forging bayonets, but horseshoes and nails for new barns. In the shipyards of New England, the saws rasped through timber to build merchant ships that would sail to the far corners of the world, carrying the flag of a new republic. The sound of America was no longer the roar of the cannon, but the hum of work, the laughter of children playing in village squares, and the quiet murmuring of prayers in white steeple churches on Sunday mornings. At Mount Vernon, on the banks of the Potomac River, the man who had led them all sat on his piazza in the evenings, watching the river flow towards the sea. George Washington, his hair now entirely white, his eyes tired but serene, had found his vine and fig tree. The burden of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. He listened to the wind, rustling through the leaves of the trees he had planted with his own hands. He watched the fireflies dancing in the twilight, tiny sparks of light against the darkening blue of the Virginia sky. He was no longer the general. He was a farmer, concerned with the rotation of crops and the harvest of wheat. In the stillness of those evenings, one can imagine he thought of the men he had lost, the friends who were gone, and the impossible journey they had taken together. But mostly he likely felt the profound peace of a duty fulfilled, a quiet satisfaction that settled over him like the evening mist. The freedom they had fought for was not a loud, boisterous thing. It was a quiet presence. It was in the freedom to wake up in the morning and know that the fruits of your labor were your own. It was in the freedom to speak your mind in the town, meeting without fear of a distant king. It was in the freedom to walk down a road that belonged to no empire, but to the people who walked upon it. This freedom echoed in the vast spaces of the continent. It echoed in the call of the loon on the northern lakes, in the rush of the waterfalls in the western mountains, and in the silence of the great plains that stretched out towards the setting sun, waiting for the future to arrive. As the years drifted by, the sharp edges of the memories softened. The revolution became a story told by grandfathers to children sitting by the fire as the winter snow piled up against the door. "I was there," they would whisper, "when the ice choked the Delaware. I was there when the stars fell over Yorktown." The stories became legends, and the legends became the dream of a nation. But tonight, in this quiet space we have created, there are no more battles to fight. The final page has been turned. The ink is dry. The parchment is rolled up and put away. The night deepens over the 13 states. The stars wheel overhead, the same indifferent, beautiful stars that watched over the freezing soldiers and the sleeping towns. They look down now on a land at rest. The rivers, the Hudson, the Delaware, the James, the Potomac, flow endlessly to the ocean, carrying the history of the land into the eternal embrace of the sea. The wind whispers through the cornfields and the forests, a gentle, rhythmic sound. Hush, hush, hush. It is the sound of a continent breathing. It is the sound of peace. And so we leave them there in the amber glow of history. We leave the farmers in their fields, the merchants in their shops, and the old general on his porch. We leave the new nation sleeping under the vast, protective dome of the night sky. The struggle is over. The freedom is won. The echoes of that freedom will ring forever, but for now there is only the silence, the darkness, and the deep, restful sleep of a story that has found its end. Good night.